Okay, dissociative states. Trance induction and dissociative states. Critical thinking skills are reduced through regular encouragement of receptive mental states. Altered states may be mild and seem normal and include concentration, fatigue, boredom, and hunger. So you see this in severe instances in religious groups where they may induce a period of fasting or labor or staying up for long periods of time in a way of breaking down somebody's cognitive and emotional foundations that make them more receptive then to the group. This is something that you'll hear Scientologists talk about happen. Certainly if you see any of the documentaries on Waco or People's Temple, it played a role there. Is there any role or any parallels that you can think of in the trans community?
Not really, except that identifying as trans itself is almost a dissociative state.
Oh, that's interesting. What do you mean by that?
It's just, I feel like I read somewhere, and I've always referred back to this. I read someone say that they think that the two main characteristics of gender dysphoria are dissociation and rumination. So it's being disconnected from your body and feeling like you're not at home in it, and then just obsessing over that idea and obsessing over different parts of your body.
So this is what transgender means. So this is a cis female. Her sex is female, and so is her brain. And this is a cis male. So his sex is male, and so is his brain. But when you're transgender, your brain does not match your body. So like this girl, she's stuck in a male's body, but her brain is female. So using things like hormones and stuff, you would want to transition. And you can also get surgeries as well to make you feel more comfortable in your own skin. So now she's going to transition. So that way her body and her brain match, which will make her happy. There she is, using she, her pronouns. It's sort of like this for a transgender male, except for you will be stuck in a female's body, so your sex will be female, but your gender is male, because your gender is like what's in your brain. So again, you don't want that. There he is, he's sad. So you'd want to transition, so then your body and brain will match. So there he is, now he, him, and that's the trans flag.
So I've always felt like dissociation was a big part of it, but I don't know if it's necessarily, maybe it is induced to the way that people talk about it.
I think you're onto something here. One of the things that first was a red flag for me in terms of drawing the connection between some religious elements of the ideology was watching a documentary on the Heaven's Gate group. It's called like the Cult of Cults. It's on HBO Max, I think. But one of the dimensions, we all remember Heaven's Gate because there was a mass suicide done where there was this like mansion in California that they just found like 39 bodies dressed all the same that were, you heard that they were a little bit androgynous, and you saw they had recorded a video about why they were doing what they did, and all the women had short haircuts and everyone was androgynous. But that didn't make the headlines. The thing that made the headlines was the suicide. So if you watch the documentary, you learn more about what they were teaching and what they identified. And the teachings of the leader included this notion that who they were as an essence was something apart from their physical body, that the physical body was just a vehicle for their essence.
The deepest part of the indoctrination came when they were convinced that they were not human beings. They were convinced that they were actually these beings from the next level above, and that they were essentially living inside these human shells, which they called vehicles.
We'll use the term vehicle when we speak of this body that we're wearing, this flesh and bones, because we don't relate to it. It's not me. It's just a suit of clothes that I wear.
And then there were elements of the physical body that were in conflict with their essence, and that was their sexuality. And the disconnect between who these people were indoctrinated to believe that they were on the road to evolving to a level higher and above human, that their sexuality was in conflict with it.
When you're in a cult, especially for any length of time, you're in what I call a self-sealing system. This is a social system that's closed in on itself. peer pressure is so important in these groups, right? So you're often comparing yourself to the people who look like they're more devoted so that you can be ridding yourself of all these human characteristics that are in this body that you happen to be living in.
Now, I'm afraid that here I need to get a little personal. Sex is the strongest drug. There's not a drug, there's not a morphine or anything that is produced by chemicals or plants of this world as strong as that drug.
Marshall Applewhite didn't like his homosexuality. So he created a myth around that piece that he didn't like. He came to a conclusion about his body that it was abhorrent.
And so they needed to remove any sexual elements from it, from their appearance. They needed to suppress any sexual feelings or desires that they had. And it went so far as them undergoing voluntary castration.
So he held a meeting and he said that he had a nocturnal emission and he was investigating having himself castrated. Would any of you have reservations of having the same procedure done? And I didn't have any reservations. I was committed to being celibate for the rest of my life.
If your eye offend you, pluck it out. It's the same idea. If something is so offensive to you that your control is threatened by it, then why shouldn't you dispose of it if you have that option to do it?
We set up a sterile room and we're going to proceed doing the castrations. They've already got the testicle sac open. And I almost fainted. So it was done. It's like surreal. That's what I'll experience here. I'm surreal about this. And Jan Odie and I went to the pier and we threw the testicles in there. They found some doctors that would do the procedure. And Doe was also castrated.
Eventually, there were, depending on which source you look to, between 7 and 9 men within the group who had been castrated.
And so when we think of an ideology that can distort and disconnect your sense of self from your physical body and lead you to make drastic decisions such as having your body surgically remove the elements of its sexuality, I think there are a lot of parallels there with what we're hearing trans people having undergone. The most recent standard of care publication of WPATH now includes eunuch as a gender identity for which chemical castration and or surgical castration is considered affirmative care.
First, I'd like to do a little history. Mostly eunuch is the oldest recognized gender outside the binary. It's in the Bible, it's in all kinds of sources. Eunuchs today, though, are mostly an invisible gender. There's no real way to present as eunuch in the Western world. Most present publicly as male. They're indistinguishable from anyone else you see on the street. Sometimes they try to appear androgynous, but there is really no way they demonstrate publicly that they are other than male. And we estimate there are 8,000 to 10,000 self-identified voluntary eunuchs in North America today. And who are these people? Who seeks voluntary castration? One type is men with an extreme gender dysphoria. They desire to be not male, to be emasculated, but don't want to be female either. They have a male to eunuch gender dysphoria, now part of the SOC8. There are others who have a feeling that their genitals are not a part of their proper part of their body integrity dysphoria. This is in the SOC8. It's also in ICD-11. It's classification 621 or 6C21. So it's there in the ICD as well as the standards of care.
Now, you've gone through the surgical phases of that trans journey. Do you see any parallels there, or hearing what I've laid out here, what's your take on it?
And no, it sounded the same, except instead of feeling like sexuality was necessarily problematic and that had to be either suppressed or removed, it was literally biological sex instead. So that's what I was doing throughout my transition, was removing every single part of me that would have given me away as female. So
Mm.
going on testosterone lowered my voice. It changed my fat distribution, which has changed back now. I had the surgeries. I had the mastectomy so that I don't have breasts anymore. That it's just, I had my uterus cut out. Basically, I removed every single part of me that would have identified me as a female as part of that. And I think that sort of process is really a process of dissociating more and more from your reality until you're just, it is fantasy at the end of it, where you're just sort of, yes, now I'm a man, except you're not really a man, you're just a woman that's removed all of the parts of you that made you, not that made you a woman, because that's something that can't be taken away, but all of the things that would help you be perceived as one. But yeah.
That there's one of these questions that come up, which is how far can indoctrination and ideology change your sense of self and bodily integrity? And so can you be brainwashed into thinking that you are the wrong gender, or that there's a disconnect between your true self and your physical body? You can ideologically destabilize someone from a sense of bodily integrity with who they think they are and their comfort within their body by giving them these ideas. Whereas somebody before who may be biologically male but has an affinity for things that are stereotypically female, in the old way of thinking rooted in biological reality, you would just say there's many different ways to be a male, and a more feminine male is still a male, and we as a society should be more embracing and accepting of feminine males. Whereas if you take this new way of thinking, a biological male who has an affinity for things that are stereotypically feminine, well, then we're going to redefine them now as that means that they are a woman. And this has all kinds of implications for what the younger generation who are gay are growing up doing. And this is why people are feeling like there may be eliminating lesbian populations, because the things that would say you were lesbian, and people are being shunted into a trans identity because of how this plays out.
So it used to be very rare for a child to be taken at all seriously if the child said, Mum, I was meant to be a girl, or I feel like I'm really a girl. But the occasional child who said that, it was almost all boys. And one possible reason for that is that being gender non-conforming as a girl is more socially acceptable. We even have a nice word for them, tomboys. We have a much less nice word for boys who are gender non-conforming. They're sissies.
Yeah.
And so sissy boys, inverted commas, I don't use this word myself, were the object of study in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. And these were highly gender non-conforming boys who would say to their parents, I was meant to be a girl. I really am a girl. I wish I was a girl. All their friends were girls. They played with girls' toys. They dressed as girls. They would even talk about how they hated their male parts. They wanted them cut off and so on. But when these children were followed into adulthood, it turned out they were nearly all gay. Now, this does not mean that every gender non-conforming little boy is gay.
Sure.
There are lots of little boys who like dressing up and so on, and, they can grow up straight as well. But statistically speaking, there is a link with being gay. Now, that was the historical picture. In the past 10 years, something quite different has happened, which is that teenage girls are by far the largest group who say that they were meant to be or really are members of the opposite sex. Lots of them aren't gay at all. Lots of them really have just spent too much time on Tumblr. It's a place where odd things happen. I have said this a few times. I don't know where I heard it first, but somebody said that social media, in particular Tumblr, is like the island in The Lord of the Flies. It's a place where the children bring each other up with no adults around. And in those places, quite strange and sometimes very distressing things happen. So Tumblr around 2015 was really the high point of girls, teenage girls, really telling each other very odd things about what it would mean to feel like you didn't fit in, to feel like your body was, not the way it was meant to be, to wish and ardently wish that really you were a boy, and maybe even a gay boy if you were a straight girl. To tell those girls that meant that they were really boys, and really to create a social contagion. And this sounds completely odd to adults, but I think only to adults who can't remember being teenagers. It's a strange and intense time, and it's also a time where you're programmed to believe your peers, your age cohort, rather than adults, and to discount what adults say, and also to be quite idealistic. to have quite grand ideas, to think that you can reinvent yourself or that you can change everything. And so those girls are being treated according to a protocol that was developed for a very different group, namely these young boys. Now, I don't think those young boys should have been treated this way anyway, but they were. And that protocol takes as gospel truth the statement, I am really a girl, I am really a boy, and assumes that something inner in that child that's unchangeable, that's been manifested in the statement, I think I'm trans, that's more real and concrete than the body that they were born in. It is incredible. But the thing is, if you believe it, it mandates quite extreme medical interventions. So those interventions, and just to remind everybody, puberty is actually quite a big deal. Yeah, puberty does quite a lot to our bodies that can't be undone. And in particular, it does a lot to boys. I know it does a lot to us girls as well, but if you take testosterone afterwards as a girl, you can pass as a man much more easily than the other way around. Testosterone is like a one-way street. Your voice breaks and it can never unbreak. Your beard comes in, you can never get rid of it without laser surgery. A lot of things happen, like your jaw widens, your shoulder was widened, your feet and hands get bigger. These are things that are very, very hard to undo. The reason we don't let children get tattoos is we know that most of them may regret it. Like, loads of people regret getting tattoos, but if you're over 18, fine. You do what you like. I have none because I knew I'd regret. But yeah, so why you wouldn't let a child get a tattoo, but you'll let them take drugs that are going to lead to permanent changes. Oh, and the other thing I should say about that pathway, this is the hardest thing to say. This shocks me because it is a true medical scandal. If you skip your own puberty entirely, you will never be fertile. You will actually be sterile because we only become fertile during puberty. The ovaries and the testicles just don't mature. You don't produce sperm. Your eggs never can ripen. So if you never go through your own puberty because you blocked it, and then you take cross-sex hormones, you will be sterile. Not just infertile, sterile. There is nothing that can help you. Not IVF, not anything. And you will probably be incapable of orgasm as well, because during puberty is when you become fully orgasmic. So what we are doing with children that we put on this pathway, if children start these drugs really at the beginning of puberty, so not even partway through puberty, we are creating sexless, sterile adults. And the reason that we are doing that is because they look better. In the word for somebody, it's a eunuch. We are creating eunuchs, and I can't believe that we're doing that, but we are.
I think you're onto something in that the whole disconnect between your sense of who you are and your gender is a form of dissociation that then facilitates and enables all the other choices in medicalization and surgery is something to really consider. And I hadn't thought of it that way before. All right. So with that being said, how are we going to score it? What score would you give it?
It's probably severe now that we've gone through it, because that's the ideology, really, is that your gender is completely separate from material reality, it just encourages that sort of dissociation.
When you start with that as your foundational assertion, then anything that contradicts that you throw away. And you say, no, this earlier foundational assertion is more important. So if something seems to contradict it, then it's just wrong, and we don't have to pay attention to that.
Pretty much all of the ideology comes down to gender identity exists. And when I detransitioned, my feeling of this was gender identity does not exist. And then if you say gender identity does not exist, or what I would say is gender identity is a concept that's built on pseudoscience, basically, it's all scientific foundations, then nothing else in the ideology makes any sense. And it's really just the one pillar that's holding it up.
Wow. The problem with you saying that is you're using words that have a general definition or a general understanding that I think is probably not specifically what you're talking about. So if you say gender identity exists, then a normie would say, I think I'm a guy, that's my identity, so yeah, my gender identity exists. But there are a bunch of assumptions that go along with that, according to the ideology.
When I'm saying that it's a pseudoscientific thing, I'm saying all of the science around it, all of the studies around it are based on an idea that they're just assuming is true. They're just
I see.
they're assuming that trans is a thing. They're assuming that gender identity is a thing, and everything that they're doing is basically set up on that sort of foundation. But if you dig deep into it, there isn't a lot of evidence that it is an innate thing. So, yeah.
Speaking about how research interfaces with this, I think the phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria and how that played out with a clinician who was trying to understand this phenomenon is a big warning sign, just in terms of how we can rely on research anyway. If there are strong, intense, potentially career-ending negative consequences for reporting on results that don't match the activism narrative, then it's going to be hard to trust science, because then we can't trust that any negative things could be reported on if they happen. Therefore, any positive things you can't really trust. And it makes it harder for physicians then to act in the way that they would act with any other form of disease or discomfort that they try to address in patients' lives.
Yeah. It's very concerning, to be honest.
Okay, so dissociative states, let's go ahead and give it a score and see what we have next.
I think I said severe.
Okay.
Yeah.